Right now, as you're listening to this, there are numerous sights, sounds, and sensations going on around you. The pressure of your feet against the floor, the slight buzz of the computer, maybe you have the TV on or some music on in the background. We can attend to only a small part of the sensations around us, and only a small part of what we attend to can be remembered. In essence, attention can be thought of as a filtering process. In cognitive psychology, there are at least 3 models which describe how attention helps us to filter information. These models can be considered loosely as metaphors which describe our internal processes. So we're going to look at 3 models, one by Broadbent, another by Treisman, and then lastly some research by MacKay. Broadbent was one of the first people to create a model to explain selective attention, and this model looked like this. The messages from the environment hit our sensory receptors, and he said that we had this sensory memory which holds incoming information for a fraction of a second. That information then gets passed on to a filter. These filters filter things based on physical characteristics such as the tone of the voice, the pitch, and so on, and then it will pass it on to the detector. This is how your children know if they are in trouble, because it's the way that you say their name. They might not be paying attention to you, but as soon as you say Amy Louise Hogan in that kind of tone, they know that they have to pay attention. So once just a small part of those incoming messages from sensory memory have passed through the filter, you can see here lots of information coming, it's hitting the filter, but then only a small amount gets through the filter, and that's the message that we attend to. So that small amount of information gets passed through to the detector, and then that processes higher level characteristics such as the meaning of the message. Once we've understood the meaning, it gets passed on to memory. Our short-term memory holds information for about 10 to 30 seconds, and then depending what we want to do with the memory, it may transfer it to our long-term memory, or we might discard it. So this was the very first model of attention, very basic idea. It's called an early selection model because the filter occurs very early. We have that filtering, much like a sieve or a colander. The message gets filtered before the information is analysed for meaning. So again, we have lots of these messages coming in from the environment. The filter occurs, only a very small amount of information gets through the filter, and then we understand what the message is. So the filter occurs early, hence it's called an early selection model. Broadbent did a bunch of experiments on this model. He tried to do this technique where he would play messages to each of the ears. So in one ear, the participants would be hearing lots of stimuli, and they were told to listen to that ear, to pay attention. And at the same time, they were getting bombarded with other messages in the other ear, and they were told to ignore those messages. And then after the experiment was over, Broadbent asked them, did they recall anything in the ear that they were meant to be ignoring? And they found that very difficult to do, to pay attention to both things at the same time. So Broadbent said that the ears, the left and right ears, act as separate channels, and they work independently of one another. There was a very famous experiment done after Broadbent proposed his early selection model, and it's called the Dear Aunt Jane experiment. So basically, participants did the experiment as I just explained. So they had in one ear, for example, if they were told to listen to their left ear, they were hearing the words Dear 7 Jane. And in the right ear, which they were told to ignore, they were hearing the words 9 Aunt and 6. So if they had done the experiment correctly, when they recall what they heard in their left ear, they should say, "Dear 7 Jane." But in fact, what participants actually did is they switched between the two ears, and they actually said, "Dear Aunt Jane." So it shows that they were analysing the message for meaning, which goes against what Broadbent was saying. So the implications of this twofold. Unlike what Broadbent said, this Dear Aunt Jane experiment shows that we can actually switch between the two ears if it's meaningful. So meaning is being processed earlier than Broadbent had originally thought. So to overcome this big criticism, Treisman created a new model of attention, and she called it Attenuation Theory. Very similar kind of idea to Broadbent, but she said that we have a selection or a filtering that occurs at two stages. So Broadbent's original filter box was replaced with two parts, an attenuator and a dictionary unit. So you still have all these incoming messages coming from the environment, and then they hit the attenuator. Now the attenuator analyzes information on like a hierarchical basis. First of all, it analyzes the meaning for physical characteristics, just like Broadbent said, so tone of voice or the pitch and so on. Then it looks for language, and then it looks for meaning. So stages 2 and 3 are only processed if the physical characteristics are unclear. So you still have the attended message, things that we were paying attention to coming through the attenuator at full force, but it allows for some of the unattended messages, those messages we were told to ignore, to come through at a lower level. So I said the attended message comes through full strength, but the unattended message is weak but still present. So this might account for the Dear Aunt Jane experiment. The Dear 7 Jane is coming through at full strength, but that word from the unattended ear is still there. And so the brain can kind of combine the two channels to make a meaningful sentence. Dear Aunt Jane. So this model is often called the leaky filter model because the unattended message can sometimes leak through. So Treisman's theory really kind of overcome some of the criticisms of Broadbent's model. So let's have a quick look at the dictionary unit. So the second stage of the filter is the dictionary unit. This is where the meaning is analysed in more detail. Treisman suggested that we have this component that contains words, and each of these words have different thresholds for being activated. So words that we are very familiar with, or words that are very common, have low thresholds. So they don't have to come through the filter at full force. They can be very weak and we'll pay attention. This is the idea, like if you're at a party and you're talking to someone, but then someone across the room says your name and you're very able to quickly go, huh? What was that? Your name is very significant to you. It hasn't got to come through full force for you to pay attention. But for example, if you heard the word rutabaga, that's not a very common word. So if someone across the room at a party said rutabaga, you're very unlikely to pay attention to that. So it kind of has to come through the filter at full force in order for you to pay attention to it. So common or important words to you have low thresholds. They can come through the leaky filter at a low level. Uncommon words have high thresholds and they really have to come through the filter at full force in order for us to pay attention to them. Words that kind of fall in the middle, like boat, kind of have like a middle threshold. So this is called an intermediate selection model because the selection occurs in two stages. It's not as early as Broadbent said. She had that physical characteristics and meaning. So it's like a middle stage. Let's have a look at the last type of model, a late selection model. This theory suggests that the filtering or the selection does not occur until the meaning has been processed. So, for example, MacKay did a similar experiment to Broadbent where people were having these messages, different messages coming into each ear. So in the ear that they were told to pay attention to, the attending ear, participants heard ambiguous sentences. For example, they were throwing stones at the bank. Now the ambiguous word here is bank. We don't know, is it a money type bank or is it a river type bank? You don't know. So in the ear that they were told to ignore, the unattended ear, they either heard words such as river or money. So remember, they're told to ignore these messages. Then, after the experiment, they were given a sentence and they had to choose the closest meaning of the attended message, so the message they were told to listen to. Now, if they heard the words river in their unattended ear, they were much more likely to pick the sentence that said, they threw stones towards the side of the river yesterday. And if they heard words such as money in the unattended ear, again the ear that they were told to ignore, they were much more likely to choose a sentence that said, they threw stones at the Savings and Loan Association yesterday. So this was a very powerful demonstration that the messages that are coming into our brain are processed for meaning much earlier than Broadbent had thought. So with late selection models, the selection does not occur until the meaning has been processed. So the filtering occurs much later on. So to summarize on the difference between early versus late selection models, Broadbent was an early selection model. He said that all these information that's coming in from our senses the filtering occurs early, and it's not until after the filter occurs that we pay attention to the meaning. Late selection models, on the other hand, say that we pay attention to the meaning and then we select and then we filter. So the filter occurs much later on than it does with the early selection models. So this is an example of Broadbent's way of thinking. This is like an example how MacKay and then Treisman is kind of somewhere in between. So those are the three models of selective attention, and you can read some more information about these three models in your textbook.